Hi guys. So over the next few weeks, you're going to learn about the different research strategies in much more detail. This week, it's all about descriptive research. You'll learn about how we do observational research, how we do survey research, and how we do case studies. This is where this week fits into the context of our course. So you'll remember from before the midterm and Jonah's slides about the different research strategies and how we highlighted that the kind of research question will inform the research strategy that we use to address that question. So if our goal is to describe a variable, we'll be doing the descriptive research strategy, whereas if our goal is to describe the relationship or explain the relationship among various variables, then we'll be using the different other research strategies. So true to its name, the purpose of the descriptive research strategy is to describe a variable or a set of variables as they exist naturally in the population. So for example, maybe we want to know what percentage of students in grade 11 eat high quality breakfast, for example. How we report that data and describe that data will depend on the kind of questions that we use and the way that we ask our participants. So if we require participants to respond to particular options or to rate their experience on a scale, well then the kind of data that we get is nominal or ordinal data. And the way that we can describe that data is by reporting how many people respond to the different options and by reporting which option is the most common. We can display this graphically using a bar graph over here. If, however, our data involves more of a continuous measure, if you remember those scales of measurement, the interval or ratio scale, then we can report this data in a different way. So for example, if we looked at how many milligrams of sugar are in different people's cereals, we can report this. This is an example of a ratio scale. We can describe this using a histogram, and we can report not only how many people responded to those different options and what the most common option is, this is the mode, but we can also look at what the average amount is and the range of data. So this is going to be important for you to know when you go to do your critic assignment, when you have to describe our class and describe different variables. But now let's take a step back, and what are some examples of descriptive research? Well, there are lots. Descriptive research is used all the time. So for example, polling data, looking at the percentage of people that vote for Trump or Biden, that's an example of descriptive research. Course evaluations, picture over here, that's an example of descriptive data. Data from Statistics Canada, that's descriptive, where we're looking at the average amount of sleep that Canadians get or the average amount of student debt. If you remember from high school or from elementary school when you went and did your EQAO or OSLT, if a school board wants to report how their students score on these tests compare to and how many meet the benchmark of obtaining the provincial standard, well, that's a snapshot of how their class and how their school is doing. This is an example of descriptive research. Here's another recent example where they had people rate how they feel like COVID has impacted their mental health. This also is a snapshot of the population describing one variable. This is an example of descriptive research. So the goal, again, is to measure a variable or set of variables as they exist naturally and simply to describe them. We're not looking at the relationship between different variables. The goal of this is to, take that snapshot and capture some behavior as it exists naturally, and maybe it'll be interesting what we find. There are three main ways that we can do descriptive research, which we'll describe now. The first is observational research. This is when the researcher simply observes, and we can observe different things. We can observe the behavior, we can record the behavior of people to describe how that behavior usually occurs in a natural situation. A good example of that is Jane Goodall and the research that she did looking at behaviors in apes. We can also measure how often or how frequently certain events happen by looking at how those behaviors are represented in social media, in books, in movies, on TV, or how it happens currently, that's content analysis, or how it's happened in the past, that's archival research. So again, rather than looking at the behavior itself, this is looking at how the behavior is represented in those different forms. How do we observe this behavior? Well, we can do natural observations where, this is an example of Jane Goodall's research, where we would just be watching the behavior as it exists in a natural setting. An example of this in children might be watching children play together to observe their social interactions. We can also observe behavior while the observer themselves is also engaging in the behavior. That's called participant observation. An example of this might be rather than watching kids play with each other from afar, you'd actually play with a child to look to see how they solve problems or communicate. Finally, a third example or class is called contrived or structured observations. And this is when we create, I mean, it sounds bad, contrived, but this is when we create a situation that's specifically designed to elicit the behavior so that we can see how often it occurs and for how long it occurs. An example of this is diagnostic testing. So, you know, all of these different methods, like all of research, all have their pros and cons, and it's up to you as a researcher to decide which method really fits your research question and your situation best. So one benefit of observing behavior as it occurs in real life situations is that, you know, we're studying how things actually happen in the world. So this gives us high external validity. There's some downsides though. If we're watching people's behavior, well, the mere existence of the researcher there might mean that people act differently because they know that they're being watched. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, if you remember, in the context of demand characteristics and reactivity. What's the solution to this? Well, the researcher can try to conceal themselves so that participants don't know that they're being watched. So for example, under one of those glass two-way mirrors, or you could have participants habituate to the presence of the examiner. Another challenge is that observations might be subjective rather than being objective, which is our goal in quantitative research. What's the solution to that? Well, we can establish before we go and do our research, what's an objective criteria and what we're looking for when we're evaluating behaviors. And we can also have multiple observers and multiple researchers observing that behavior and look to see if those different observers come up with similar results. This, if you remember from a few weeks ago, is inter-rater reliability. We'd want to find high inter-rater reliability. Finally, another challenge might be that there might not be an opportunity for the behavior to occur. And so if it doesn't happen, you can, you know, comment on how often it occurs. A solution to that, again, is those contrived situations where you create a situation where you try to elicit that behavior. So for example, if you wanted to look at how children with ASD play with their friends, you might create a situation where they actually have to interact with other children so that you can look at, you know, how often that interaction or how long that interaction happens for. If we left it up to the child themselves, they might not seek out those interactive opportunities. So a lot of this might ring some bells to you if you have taken 2P51 or if you're currently taking it. A lot of observational research can also be done using qualitative methods, not just quantitative methods. So qualitative observation, let's say, of the way that a child interacts with their peers might be journaling in what context this boy plays with himself versus with his peers, or writing down which toys he plays with while he's playing with his friends. Taking a more quantitative approach is breaking this into numbers. So we might be looking at how many times that behavior occurs within a given time period, how long a behavior occurs within a time period. This is called the frequency method or the duration method, respectively. Or we can do a sort of combination of the two, which is what we're getting at with the interval method, where we split up the time into these intervals, and then we look at how many intervals that behavior occurs in. This is a great matching activity for you to try. If you pause this video and see if you can do it at home, or to see if you could match up these different kinds of observational research with their definition. So let's move on to the next category of descriptive research, surveys. A research study that uses a survey asks participants to respond how they feel about something or how often they engage in a certain behavior, rather than us watching that behavior and observing it. The benefit of this is that it's much faster. The downside is that it requires the participants to be truthful and to respond truthfully. If you remember from a few weeks ago, when we talked about modalities of measurement, survey research gets into that category of self-report measures. So again, the same goal exists for surveys as observational research. Our goal is to describe a variable and get a snapshot of a group at a particular time. But here we're asking participants to give us that snapshot rather than, taking it ourselves. Some things to consider when you do surveys are what type of questions you're asking, how to arrange the questions, who we survey, and how we administer the survey. I'm going to be focusing on this first topic, what type of questions, but please review those other things to consider by reading over your textbook. So there are three main types of questions that we can use in a survey. We can ask open-ended questions where we allow participants to respond in their own words. An example of that would be a short answer or essay question on an exam. We can ask restricted questions where we present a number of possible options and participants have to pick one. An example of that would be a multiple choice type style exam. Or we can ask rating style questions where we ask participants to rate, from 1 to 5, how well they think certain statements apply to them. Which of these are qualitative? Which of these are quantitative? Well, the open-ended questions is much more qualitative, and these other options are much more quantitative in nature. I'm going to give you some examples of these now. So let's say we wanted to ask participants what their ethnicity is. This is often asked in questionnaires. We could simply ask it like this in an open-ended style and ask participants to write in what they want. The benefit of this is that it gives real flexibility. Participants aren't, binned into a certain box. They can answer how they'd like. The challenge, though, with that is that it's up to the researcher then to interpret what participants write and to, put that into different categories. So as a result, often researchers will use a more restricted style of asking questions. This is an example of a question that was part of a survey that I administered to participants as part of a larger research project that I was involved in. So I didn't create this questionnaire. I won't say which funding agency asked me to do this, but it was part of a larger study. And one of my participants rightfully pointed out, they said, what the fuck? Like, why is there only one category here to represent me when if for Asian people, there's so many other categories? This person was right. This is a problem with these restricted questionnaires, is that the researcher has created the options and has binned participants, and the participants then have to fit themselves into bins. Another problem that often exists with ethnicity questions, it doesn't exist with this one because select all that apply is there, but as my husband points out, he's got mixed roots, and for him, he needs to check off multiple boxes. And if the questionnaire is so restricted that it doesn't allow for that, then you're not really getting a truthful response from participants if they don't feel like that any of those questions apply to them. So like this theme throughout this course is there's pros and cons to which type of question you want to use. And so a solution is really to look at other studies that have been done in other questionnaires and try to see what seems to have worked in the past. How do we report this data in, our results section of a paper? Well, how we report the data depends on the scale of measurement. These questions, both of these, both give us nominal data. So what we can do is report the percentage of participants that selected different options, or we can report the most common option. We can't take an average, for example, and say what the average ethnicity is. Here's another example of a restricted question. Here we're asking participants to indicate their approximate total household income, and they have to choose one option. These options are arranged in increasing size. So this is an example of an ordinal data. Again, technically speaking, the best way for us to report this data is to report how many people responded to the different options and to report the most commonly responded option. If instead we presented it as an open-ended question and people wrote down their average household income in numbers, then this would be now ratio data, and we could report an average. This is an example of a Likert type scale. You've probably seen these kind of questionnaires before, where you read a statement and you have to say to what extent that statement applies to you by circling, an option between 1 and 5. These are typically created using an odd number of questions so that the middle option is the neutral one, and people can use that as an anchor point to decide whether they, fall above it or below it. Again, this uses the ordinal scale. So to summarize some of what I just said, if our data uses the nominal or ordinal scale, we can report percentage of people who respond to different options, the proportion of people who respond to the different options, but we can't take the average. We can only report the average when the data uses the interval or ratio scale. So in your textbook talks a lot about some tips and guidelines for both constructing and administering a survey. Read over this because it's really important. How we construct a survey has implications, if you remember way back when we talked about measurement validity, which is how well a test tests what it intends to test. If we don't ask the questions very well, then we may not have a measure that scores high on those different aspects of measurement validity. If people also are not able to respond truthfully because of the situation that it's administered in, then that might have implications for internal validity. Similarly, how we sample our participants, that has implications for external validity, which we talk about here. So this repeats a lot of what you learned about in the chapter about sampling participants, and same thing applies here. So selecting who we want to do our survey, we want to make sure that the people that we ask to do the survey, well, those questions are relevant for them. And we want to make sure that our sample can generalize to the general population. And when in doubt, you should, if you're creating your own survey, you should ask for help or look for surveys that have been done in the past so that you can be sure that your survey, your questionnaire has high overall validity. Okay, the final category of descriptive research that we're going to talk about now is the case study design. This is when we do an in-depth study and get a detailed description of one single individual or maybe a very, very small group of people, like 3, 4, or 5. This might be because they have a very unusual medical condition, or maybe they're engaged in a very new intervention or treatment. But we have to remember with case studies that there, with only a few participants, there really are some issues with external validity here. That being said, case studies can be really useful in describing those unique medical conditions or giving a counterexample to a rule. So let's say, for example, your hypothesis is, that you can't learn a second language as an adult as fluently as a native speaker. If you find one person who can do it, then this is an exception to your rule that can, provide support against a hypothesis. A great example of a case study comes from HM. You probably have learned about him in some of your other classes. So HM, I'll just briefly review here. He had epilepsy and had surgery for his epilepsy, and a particular part of his brain was removed, his hippocampus and part of his medial temporal lobe. Because after his surgery, they found that HM had difficulty forming new memories, and in particular forming new explicit memories, which is the memory of events or facts, people, places, things that have happened to him in his life. He couldn't remember that new information, although he could remember new skills. And by studying him, we've really come to understand that these two systems of explicit memory and implicit memory, rely on different parts of the brain. So an example of something that he could do, an implicit task, was a mirror drawing. You can try this at home and see how well or how poorly you do. If you draw a star and then hold that star up to your drawing of a star up to a mirror or your phone or reflective surface, and then just looking at the reflection, see if you can draw and accurately trace your star. You might find that this is really difficult, but if you practiced it every day, you'd get better. And the same thing happened with HM. Every day he was given this task and he got better, although he didn't remember having ever done it or having ever met the researchers before. So this is a great example of how an in-depth study of one person has really informed our understanding of a phenomenon that applies to all people. So a lot of what we talked about today in descriptive research can be done with both qualitative methods and quantitative methods. A lot of these can be done using both of these methods. Mixed methods is when we combine the two methods together. By combining qualitative methods, which is more about the subjective narrative of somebody's experience and what that experience means to them, and combining that with quantitative methods, which is a more objective description of that experience using numbers, looking at how often something happens or for how long it happens. When we combine those two methods together, we can get a richer picture of the behavior and can inform future research. So to summarize, today you learned about descriptive research strategy. The goal of descriptive research is to describe a variable. We're not looking at the relationship between variables or the cause of that relationship. We'll be talking about that in other weeks. There are three main types of descriptive research: observational research, survey research, and case study research. In observational research, we observe and describe actual behaviors as they occur naturally. What do we observe? Well, we can observe people, or we can observe how people are represented in media, current day, or in historical records. How do we do this? We can do this through natural observations, participant observations, or contrived observations. And all of these have their pros and cons. And so it's up to you as a researcher to pick the technique that you think works best for your research question. And when you're reading research studies, to really think about whether the way that they went about just collecting their data makes sense to you. In survey research, we describe people's responses to using their own attitudes or their own experience of an event. We have to consider what type of questions, how best to arrange the questions, who to survey, and how to administer the survey. Finally, we talked about case studies, which is when we want to describe the behavior of one person or a small group of people in more detail. This is really useful for giving information about a rare behavior or to show exceptions to the rule. Finally, descriptive research is often used with other research strategies. And, to set the foundation, if we understand how one variable works, then we are in a better place to then understand how that variable relates to other variables. This is why I moved this lecture, this chapter earlier in our course. Descriptive research is also another great example of how qualitative and quantitative research can be used together. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.